Thank you. And thank you to the Chem Centre and to the university for inviting me back to my alma mater. I mean, I was an undergraduate here many years ago. And I was aware from some of the tweets and some of the publicity around this event that I'm certainly being cast in the role of a meta-analysis hater. And I think my position is very close to Winston Churchill's remarks about democracy, which is that it's the worst possible way to run a country apart from the alternatives. And I just want to give you a couple of stories about meta-analysis, which I think are really important. The first is to do with what we call cot death in this country, the sudden infant death syndrome in the United States. And for many years, the advice from people like Dr. Benjamin Spock was that babies should be put to sleep on their stomachs. And there were lots of studies that showed that this might not be such a good idea, but in the absence of a way of accumulating the evidence, people said, well, it's, some research says this, some research says that. And the predominant way of synthesizing research was either with a narrative review, somebody would read it and form a judgment about where the balance of evidence was, or they would just count significant results. They would tally, pluses versus minuses and work out, well, if there's more minuses than pluses, then it's a bad thing. And if there's more pluses than minuses, it's a good thing. And then some systematic reviews of this area came through, which showed that it was much better to put babies to sleep on their backs. In Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and the United States, these back-to-sleep campaigns were launched, and the incidence of sudden infant death syndrome was reduced by 75% within a couple of years. It was just an extraordinary example of the power of meta-analysis to actually synthesize the research and produce really policy-relevant evidence. Another good example is the use of antiarrhythmic drugs in heart attacks. So in the 1970s, it was widely believed that giving people antiarrhythmic drugs if they'd had a heart attack was a good thing. And Kurt Furberg, a medical researcher at Bethesda in Maryland, tried to synthesize the research in 1983. And he didn't use meta-analysis. I don't know if he knew about it or not. But he came out with the conclusion that it's not clear whether this works or not. And so the use of these drugs continued. And then 10 years later, with some colleagues, he produced a meta-analysis of the research, a synthesis of this research evidence that showed that the use of these drugs increased the risk of death by 14%. And Thomas Moore, a journalist, estimated that the use of antiarrhythmic drugs actually killed more Americans than died in the whole of the Vietnam War. And as Archie Cochrane would have said many years ago, it's the scandalous failure to accumulate research that caused this tragedy. Because the studies were there, we just couldn't put them together in a way that made sense. So I'm a huge fan of meta-analysis. I want to make that really clear. But I think that doing meta-analysis in education brings special problems that people aren't talking about and therefore leads people to misinterpret them. And so I want to sort of lay out an agenda about why meta-analysis is really hard to do well. And I think that, I don't know if it's harder in education than in other fields. I have a suspicion it is, but obviously that's a very subjective judgment. So I want to talk through some of the issues that I see we'll need to solve if meta-analysis is going to be useful. And I think some of them are pretty intractable. So I'm not saying here's the agenda for solving these problems. Here's the agenda for finding out if we can solve these problems. So I want to start out by talking about different kinds of approach to research. And David Goff, my colleague at the Institute of Education, has pointed out that you can do research syntheses for many different reasons. And I quite like this diagram where he contrasts aggregative versus configurative reviews. So in an aggregative review, the idea is to come out and say, what is the finding of this area of research? And so here the really important thing is you have an exhaustive search, you avoid bias, you try to get a precise estimate of the effect. But it's also useful sometimes to do different kinds of reviews. I found this very helpful in making sense of my own work with Paul Black on formative assessment. So in 1998, we published a pretty lengthy review of the research. People call it a meta-analysis, which is interesting because they haven't read it. Because actually, section 8 of the paper is called No Meta-Analysis. It's a bit of a giveaway, really. Yeah, maybe they didn't read that bit. And what we concluded was we didn't feel ready to do a meta-analysis because the field wasn't well enough organized. So sometimes a systematic review can actually give some shape to the field, which then allows you to ask what the right questions are. For example, what kinds of moderators should you be using in your moderator analysis? And so I think these are both important components of effective research synthesis. I'll post all my slides available on my website as soon as I finish this presentation, and all my slides are available under a Creative Commons license. So formally it's a use, attribute, do not modify. So as long as you tell people where you got them from, you can use them for whatever purpose you find useful. Okay, so I borrowed this definition from the Cochrane collaboration. And they say a systematic review attempts to collate all empirical evidence that fits pre-specified eligibility criteria in order to answer a specific research question. And so I think most people, are reasonably happy with that kind of definition. We could argue with some of the bits, but I think that's a very helpful definition of what you're trying to do with a systematic review. And I've used that definition because the Cochrane collaboration specifically defined meta-analysis as an aspect of systematic review. So they say many systematic reviews contain meta-analyses. So it's this use of statistical methods to summarize independent studies. And so the last line there, meta-analyses facilitate investigations of the consistency of evidence across studies and exploration of differences across studies. So I think that's quite a helpful clarification. Some people use these terms interchangeably. I think it's very helpful to distinguish between systematic reviews on the one hand, which could include qualitative studies, and meta-analysis, which is a specific technique. So they list some quite helpful characteristics of systematic reviews: objectives, a reproducible methodology, systematic search, assessment of validity, and a systematic presentation of characteristics. The one I think is hardest in education is the third one. So when Paul Black and I started trying to review research on formative assessment, we found there was no consistency in the labels that people were using. Some people called it assessment for learning, some people called it responsive pedagogy, some people called it formative assessment. So when we tried to do automated searches, we were either finding too many sources, literally tens of thousands, or we were getting searches that left out things we knew were important. And so we actually resorted to a manual search, and by manual I mean using hands in the library to get things off shelves. We actually went out to the library. We chose 76 of the most likely journals, and we actually physically inspected every single issue of these 76 journals over a 10-year period. Read abstracts, and that's why we actually managed to get some shape on the field, because we were theorizing in the data collection. We were trying to figure out what is likely to be relevant to this field. So it turned out that mastery learning was all about formative assessment. But we hadn't realized at the beginning because we hadn't thought it through. But in fact, it was Benjamin Bloom in 1968 who actually first advocated for teaching becoming a contingent process. You couldn't judge what students had learned until you collected evidence. So the point is that the theorization was conducted in the data analysis, which wouldn't be the case if you're doing a systematic review. So I want to list a number of different problems. There's a list here as a summary. There's basically 7 things that I think we need to be worried about in meta-analysis. And I'm going to start with inappropriate comparisons. So when I see people doing meta-analysis, and people like Larry will just say, well, that's just bad meta-analysis. And you're absolutely right. None of this will be a surprise to anybody who's studied meta-analysis in any depth. What I'm saying is a lot of people are doing meta-analyses that don't attend to these cautions, and therefore the results of their meta-analyses are at best misleading. So if you look at John Hatties' work on visible learning, one of the top effect sizes, he says, is student self-reported grades. He reports an effect size of 1.6 standard deviations. And when people see that, they assume it's an effect of an intervention. If we just get students to report their own grades, their achievement will go up by 1.6 standard deviations. That's not what it means at all. It just means that smart kids know they're smart. So there's an association between those 2 things. Students' own self-reports of grades are very close to teachers' reports of those grades. And so very often what you find is things that are reported as effects are really just associations. The second thing is cross-level comparisons. So there's one study by Gallimore and his colleagues at Stanford, and they look at teachers doing formative assessment, and they report an effect size of 0.79 standard deviations. And so people go around quoting this effect size of 0.79 standard deviations, but it turns out to be at the teacher level, not at the student level. So in other words, teachers who engage in this process of formative assessment had achievement that was 0.79 standard deviations higher than teachers not doing this. And if you assume that the correlation of teacher quality with student progress is about 0.15, which is what Rick Hanischek's estimates suggest, then the effect size at the student level is only around 0.2, 0.3. But the important point is often these effect sizes get added together in a meta-analysis, and because people don't know to do a moderator analysis, those things just get averaged. Net effects versus gross effects. I think this is very important in the context of Hatties' work in particular. So he actually talks about the barometer of influence, and he says that anything less than 0.4 is not worth having. And he's actually inconsistent about what this 0.4 means. At some points, he seems to suggest that it's 1 year's annual progress. And at some points, he seems to suggest that 0.4 is the typical effect size you get from any educational intervention. That's because that may be to do with the power, which we'll look at later. Interestingly, I think he's just about right on the 0.4 in terms of developmental effects and teacher effects. So there's some quite interesting studies of kindergarten students that suggest that the progress that kids make is about 1/3 maturation and about 2/3 teacher activity. So there's certainly kids get smarter because they're on the planet and thinking and talking, and teachers add something to that. But this has led to this idea that any effect size of less than 0.4 is not worth having. And so I see that a lot in my work with teachers when I say, well, a good example would be growth mindset. Victoria Sisk's meta-analysis produced an average effect size of 0.08. And people say, well, that's not worth having, is it? Well, yes, actually, because it turns out that most of these children are older than about 10 years old. So 1 year's progress is about 0.4 standard deviations. And these interventions took about 3 or 4 hours per year. So actually, it's a pretty amazing cost-benefit trade-off. But the point is that people actually overinterpret these results and therefore think, well, we can reject anything with an effect size of less than 0.4. The other thing that's interesting is it suggests that people are looking for a silver bullet. What is the one thing we're going to do to improve achievement? Rather than, as British cycling has discovered, you don't win gold medals by trying to do one big thing. You do lots of little things, like having the cyclist's mattress travel with them so they get a good night's sleep. It's shaving the legs. It's all those marginal improvements that actually improve the system. And I think that's how we're going to improve education. And then the other problem that I see in a lot of meta-analyses is a failure to distinguish between business as usual versus alternative treatment. So what is interesting, especially as what Christine and Rob said this morning, it's interesting. There's a recent study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that suggests that people would rather one of two policies be adopted without any evidence than to have the two policies tested in a head-to-head comparison. Isn't that interesting? So if you've got drug A versus drug B, people would rather politicians just chose one and mandated it than actually find out which one is actually more effective. It's just really weird how human brains work. And of course, the other thing is, the thing I should have said more about is the net effects versus the gross effects. So when Paul Black and I worked with some teachers, we actually reported an effect size of 0.32. See, I'm not against effect size. I use them in my own work. And of course, people say, well, that's less than 0.4. Well, no, this was net, because we actually compared these teachers with other teachers in the same schools not doing formative assessment. And so we've kind of netted off whatever the growth was, leaving a net effect size of 0.32. And in many meta-analyses, they don't control for the fact that some of these reported effect sizes are net and some are gross. Now, thoughtful meta-analysts know to control for this, or at least do a moderator analysis. But the point is, others don't. So another thing that Adrian Simpson has pointed out, as indeed have many others, is that there may be what's we used to call many years ago an aptitude treatment interaction. And I just want to share one study with you which shows this. I came across this study when economists that I was talking to were saying that incentives work for teachers. So basically giving teachers bonuses, differentiated compensation as it's called often, that it works. It improves student achievement. And so I looked at the things they were citing, and I found one of them was this study by Esther Duflo and her colleagues. So these are 113 non-formal education centers. Teachers were paid 1,000 rupees a month, typically, so they did a randomized experiment, randomly allocating half the teachers to carry on getting 1,000 rupees a month, and other teachers paid according to whether they turn up for work, which is a problem in these centers. Basically, absentee rates were upwards of 30%. So these teachers in the experimental group were given time-stamping cameras, and they had to actually take a photograph of themselves with at least, I think, 10 children in the camera, time-stamped, 2 photographs, time-stamped 5 hours apart, send them in the post, and if they did that, that was counted as a day of attendance. I suppose they could have snuck off in the lunchtime, but and they were paid more. And what is interesting is that it did increase attendance from about 60% in the control group to 80%, where they were given bonuses, and that had an increase. That produced an increase in student achievement. And so this is the evidence that bonus pay works for teachers. But the point I want to make is it might be useful if teachers are not turning up for work. But if your teachers are turning up for work, it's not going to solve your problem. So I think this really important point is often we fail to take into account the aptitude treatment interactions, the fact that this intervention might be appropriate for some groups and not others. Did you control for that? Many of you will be familiar with the file draw problem. I think recent work by people like Simonson and others and Ioannidis has shown just how big a problem this is. So one estimate is that it is roughly 12 times easier to get a paper published in education if the result is statistically significant. This was a study in health education. But basically, I think most people seem to believe, and there is some evidence to support this, that significant results are easier to get published than non-significant results. And so the problem is, because of the low power of many education experiments, experiments only get published if everything happens to go particularly well. So for those of you who don't know, the power of an experiment is the likelihood that the experiment will yield an effect that is large enough to be significant. Now, I want to be clear. I should have been more precise and said it's actually an analysis that's powered. It's not the experiment. So let's say just talk about the main analysis. So you do your experiment and you find out that your new treatment for schizophrenia improves outcomes. Unfortunately, your experiment wasn't big enough, so your result isn't significant. So this has been a huge issue in the medical field for a long, long time. There's no point in doing the experiment if you can't find enough schizophrenics to work with for the result ever to be significant, even if you're effective. Obviously, this will depend on what significance level you're using, how big an effect you're looking for, and the size of the experiment. But estimates of the typical effect size of studies in psychology is about 0.4. What that means is, of all the experiments that are done in psychology, only 40% of them will produce a significant result, even if the effect is real and is as big as the researchers believe. A recent study in neuroscience showed that the typical neuroscience experiment may have a power of only 0.2. My own best guess in education is about 0.4. So what does that mean? Only lucky experiments get published. So the claim is that experiments that get published are not selective, are not representative of all the experiments that would have been done. And of course, it's called the file draw problem because it's in the file draw. And you don't know how many other researchers elsewhere in the world are doing this. And this is a real problem in pharmaceuticals, as Ben Goldacre pointed out in his book, Bad Science, because if you have a new treatment, it costs something up to about $2 billion to bring a new drug to market these days. If you have a new treatment for a particular disease, and you find it doesn't work, do you give up? No. You do the experiment again in a different country. And if that doesn't work, you try again. what Ronald Coase, the economist, called torturing the data until it confesses. You just keep on going on until you get the significant result. You do a different analysis. So you do this thing called outcome switching. So I've modeled the effect here. So let's say we have an intervention on collaborative learning, say, that has a true effect size of 0.4. Okay, so let's imagine that the true effect size is 0.4. So if every experiment was 100% powered, you'd get an effect size of 0.4. If your power of the average experiment is 0.8, and you only publish the significant results, the average of the reported studies will be 0.47, and as your power drops, the effect size of the significant studies goes up. So just with the typical power of education, let's say 40%, what that is showing is an effect that is really 0.4 will in the literature appear to be about 0.6, just because of the publication bias, the file drawer effect. Another particularly significant issue in meta-analysis in education is a failure to actually account for the intensity of the intervention. So, for example, was it, response to intervention? Was it an 8-week program or a 2-week program? If that isn't controlled for, then you're not comparing like with like. Class size reduction. Does class size reduction work? Well, it depends how much you do it by. And what I rarely see is people actually talking about the percentage of class size reduction. And then collateral effects. So this is a really important point in ability grouping, and my own work in that field is actually, I think, now rather problematic. I did one experiment where we actually followed a group of about 1,000 students in 6 secondary schools in London as they moved from being taught in mixed ability groups in year 7 to being taught in sets higher up the school. And we kind of used a differences in differences approach, and we thought we'd proved that the more a school delayed the ability grouping, the better the results were. So we thought we'd shown something about ability grouping. But more recently, I've discovered that teacher quality effects are pretty huge. And in most schools, when they group kids by ability, the best teachers get given to the highest achieving students. So now I don't know how to interpret my results. I don't know whether it's a grouping effect or whether it's a teacher quality effect. So the point is, the collateral effects, the assignment of teachers, turns out to be almost impossible to get a handle on. A recent Education Endowment Foundation research project tried to persuade schools to randomly allocate teachers to sets and found that, I don't know if any of them were willing to do it, but certainly not enough of them were willing to do it to make it a good experiment. Perhaps the most important issue, I think, and this is still quite controversial, but I think it is very important, is that meta-analysis often it fails to account for variation in the variability of the sample. So in a textbook, a book written in 1981, Jean Glass, Barry McGaw, and Mary Lee Smith suggested that the standard deviation of most achievement tests in elementary schools is 1 grade equivalent. So this is where this idea came from, the idea that 1 year's growth is 1 standard deviation. I've written to Barry McGaw. He hasn't answered me yet. I don't know. I'd be interested to see where they got this from, because even the available data at the time does not support this conclusion. Okay. So more recently, Howard Bloom and his colleagues have suggested that if you look at standardized tests, then there's a very sharp drop. Now, I've had arguments with people like Laurie Shepard about this. She says that not all tests show this, and I argue that's true, but it's only where the equating techniques squeeze out the differences. So I think there is very little doubt, I think. It goes back to Quetelet 100 and something years ago. As kids get older, they get more variable. I mean, the simplest model that explains this is John Carroll's model, which is just aptitude. There's no such thing as aptitude other than how much time you take to learn stuff. And he pointed out that a kid at the 95th percentile of aptitude learns 5 times faster than a kid at the 5th percent of aptitude. So basically, kids get more variable because they've had more time. The more apt kids have had more time to pull apart. We get that spread, and every analysis that I've seen suggests that is actually the case, that as kids get older, they get more variable. And that's why 1 year's growth becomes less. These are standardized tests. I want to point out that I don't think you get the same result for the kinds of assessments we use in England. There is something special about the construction of standardized tests that makes them less sensitive to the effects of teaching. Let's say you've got a test that you want to use at the beginning of year 7 and the end of year 7. And you've got this question, which is really good because every single kid gets it wrong at the beginning of year 7 and they get it right at the end of year 7. That's a really good question because it's clearly measuring something that year 7 teachers are teaching pretty well. It'll never get included in the test because it has no discrimination. It's not adding to the discrimination and therefore it's lowering reliability. So when you wanted to make your test more reliable, you drop these items and replace them with items of average difficulty, even if this is not something that is measuring what teachers are changing, it'll make your test more reliable. So the construction of standardized tests, the need for reliability systematically removes items that actually measure what it is that teachers are teaching effectively on average. And so it's not surprising to me that standardized tests produce these kinds of patterns. And some people have said this is not representative. Here is some stuff that I found when I was rooting through the ETS archives when I lived in the US in Princeton. And so these are their sequential tests of educational progress. And so you can see different tests. This is from 1957, by the way, okay? And there's something interesting going on around about 12th, 13th grade. So 13th grade is the first year of college. There's something weird going on there. But you can see initially quite large annual effects, but getting smaller. More recently, I found these data from Connecticut in their state tests. And so I would say that there's pretty strong evidence now that an effect size for older kids is not comparable to an effect size for younger kids. We can argue about the magnitude of these effects, but whenever you actually just average effect sizes and don't use age as a moderator of effect, then I don't think your results are interpretable. Because it's the balance of older kids versus younger kids that matters, and people are saying, well, it'll all wash out. You don't know that. And so the problem is people are making these claims without understanding these issues. So studies with younger children produce larger estimates. Here's an interesting thing. At one time, we thought that formative assessment had a bigger impact on kids with special needs. I'm not so sure about that anymore, because if you look at kids with special needs, those populations are less variable. And therefore, it could be a restriction of range effect rather than a greater utility of the intervention. So, I mean, I think this is problematic. And the other thing, you also get the same thing with gifted students. Okay, selection of studies. So this is one of the interesting things because of the incentives in higher education. Maria Ruiz Primo and Min Lee looked at feedback interventions. And they estimated that 75% of the studies they found were done by psychology professors on their own students. Somebody once joked that psychology students are the most researched species on the planet for two reasons. One is that psychology professors are lazy, and the other is that psych students will do anything for course credit. In fact, many psych programs now require students to participate in experiments as part of their course. So they found 9,000 studies on feedback in science and technology. They found that only 238 were worth looking at, and they found 111 of them had actual numbers in them, which is, I think, quite an interesting indictment of the kind of research that's being done these days. What is nice about this is they produced, before they did their analysis, a very sophisticated typology of feedback. So before beginning their meta-analysis, they did a very sophisticated theoretical analysis of what kinds of studies these were. And so I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you can see that this is a very thoughtful way of thinking about what kinds of things we should be looking at as being significant variables in the meta-analysis. And so one of the interesting things they found is that feedback treatment is a single event lasting minutes, 85% in the maths studies, 72% in the science. So basically what's happening is that students are being invited into the lab, they're tested, they're given some feedback, they're tested again, and then sent away. Now that might be interesting to psychology professors. The question is, does that apply in classrooms? What does that have to say? And when you think that 75% of the studies are of this kind, then it raises questions about generalizability to other contexts, which Nancy Cartwright has written extensively about. And that, these are problems that people aren't talking about. The last one I want to just talk a little bit about is this issue of sensitivity to instruction, because I find it a very hard issue to get my head around. So I've highlighted already that the procedure that we use to construct standardized tests seems to systematically, or at least create an incentive to, remove items that do not discriminate between children, and therefore remove items that are the things that teachers are effectively teaching. So what we want, actually, if we're going to measure the effect of an intervention, is items that really measure whether students are learning what they're being taught. And it's a very hard thing to get your head, I find it hard to get my head around this, but I just want to just illustrate how significant a factor this is. So Maria Ruiz Primo, with her colleagues, produced this, I think, quite useful classification. It's a very rough and ready idea, but she's trying to say, how close is this assessment to what was being taught? So a close assessment would be, an immediate assessment would be just looking at the work the students had done. A close assessment would look at a related thing to what they'd just been taught. So if the immediate assessment asked about the number of pendulum swings in 15 seconds, the close assessment would ask about the time taken for 10 swings. Clearly the same thing, but in a different way. A proximal assessment, if the immediate assessment asked students to construct both out of paper cups, the proximal assessment would be about what makes a bottle float. So it's the same concept, but being applied in a different context. A distal assessment would be from a different domain, with different procedures and so on. And then what she called remote were standardized achievement tests. So they're relatively remote from the actual instruction. So then they calculated the effect size of the studies they found on feedback for different kinds of assessment. And they compared close versus proximal. So when the studies used a close assessment, the average effect size was about 1.2. Where the feedback used a proximal assessment, the effect size was only about a fifth as big. So when you get an average effect size of, say, 0.4 for feedback, is that because you've got lots of proximal ones in there or not? Well, the point is, unless everybody goes back and redoes the analyses, you don't know whether the effect sizes you've got are the result simply of the sensitivity of the measures in the different experiments. Now, here's why this is important. Smart researchers will use sensitive measures because you get bigger effect sizes and therefore you get more power. So there's an incentive in experimental design for experimenters to produce measures that actually are very, very sensitive. In fact, some studies I've seen, they actually basically repeat the instruction. So the assessment becomes, were you there and paying attention rather than did you learn anything? And that's natural because it increases the power of the study, therefore increases the likelihood of a significant result. But then it makes it less relevant for applying to policy contexts like GCSE or A-level. So just to conclude this, I think some problems are unavoidable. And so I'm not saying that researchers can get much handle on this. So I think aptitude treatment interactions, sensitivity to instruction, and the way studies are selected, these are inevitable problems. They're always going to be with us. We should discuss them, but I don't think we can do much about it. I think some problems are avoidable. Inappropriate comparisons, file draw problems, intervention quality, variation in variability. These could be controlled for by moderator analyses, but often aren't. The problem is, my criticism is many of the people doing meta-analysis in education, they don't discuss the unavoidable problems and they don't avoid the avoidable problems. So what I'm saying is we need to go back and look at these meta-analyses and see to what extent did they take account of these things before we can trust them. So this is why meta-analysis in education is really hard, but I think it also then provides us with a consumer guide. So these are the things I think you should be thinking about when you look at a meta-analysis. Is there a funnel plot, for example, to test whether the biggest effect sizes are being found in the smallest experiments, which is evidence, not necessarily, but is at least a pointer towards publication bias. So when I raise these issues with people who are pretty uncritical about their use of meta-analysis, nobody in this room, of course, the kinds of things like they say are the effects, your criticisms are valid, but the effects average out. I'm saying you don't know that. You might be right, but you have no scientific basis for concluding that. And so, for example, let's look at class size reduction. If you don't control for the magnitude of the class size reduction, the experiments that will dominate the literature are the experiments that are cheapest to carry out. And of course, class size reduction experiments won't very, very often include professional development for teachers to take advantage of the smaller classes. And that is a really important point, because that's why I suspect that we get bigger effects with younger children than from older children, because younger children, the teachers teach pretty much individually or small groups. So with a smaller class, there's more individual attention for each child. But a teacher standing in front of a class of 20 and talking at them isn't actually that much better than a teacher standing in front of a class of 30 and talking at them, or indeed 300. But the point is that if you added professional development, this is the point that Peter Blatchford makes all the time, you might get a different result. But those experiments are more expensive, harder to get funding for, and therefore they're not likely to dominate the literature. So what I'm saying is there is no reason to suspect that the literature that's published is at all representative of the world they claim to represent. The second point is, the rank order of effects is still okay. That's another claim I hear. So yes, so we may not get, Hattie claims that feedback has an effect size of 0.8. I don't believe that, because I think 0.4 is pretty big, and therefore I think it's just unrealistic. Learning with feedback is not going to triple the speed of learning. Sorry, treble the speed of learning. So I don't know this, but I think that the assumptions that you need to make to ignore these criticisms are pretty unlikely. The more significant challenges, as Tone Kvernbeck says, it's all about the tales not told. It's the experiments that weren't done. The things that are missing from the literature for a whole range of reasons. The other point, I think Nancy's made this point many times, what you're really showing is what worked, not what works. So I'm very pleased that a program that I developed with my partner that was the subject of a randomized controlled trial, we sent half the schools these professional development materials, and the other half got the cash equivalent. And 2 years later, the schools getting our materials scored higher on their GCSEs. So I'm pretty convinced that this made a difference. But the point is, we can't assume, it was an intention to treat analysis, so I think it's a pretty strong design, but I can't assume that the schools that chose to volunteer for the experiment are representative of the ones that did not volunteer to participate. And therefore, yes, I think what happened in the schools in the experiment was better in the experimental group than the control group. We don't know that would apply to other schools. So it's about, the best we can do with an RCT is what worked. We then have to do serious theoretical work to say, will this apply in the context we did not research? And some people will say, along with David Hume, that the problem of induction is actually impossible to solve. But I think, for me, the biggest issue coming out of this, and I think the issue that I'm still grappling with and I'm still very uncertain about, is whether we can actually ever identify conditions under which standardized effect sizes are both justifiable and useful. Now, what I mean by that is this. Obviously, if effect sizes are on students of different ages, then they're not easily to compare. But let's say we control all these things. Let's say we control all these things like age, and let's say we also control sensitivity to instruction by, for example, using the same measure. So if we're looking to improve secondary school achievement, we could all agree to use Attainment 8, the GCSE grades, as our outcome measure. In which case, we don't need standardized effect size. We can just use the grade difference. So what I'm saying is, I think there's an interesting area for policy here. The question is, can we identify a set of conditions that make effect sizes across different experiments comparable, but not identical? Because if they're identical, we don't need effect size. We could just use the raw measure, as they do in medicine, as they did in those experiments those studies of cot death and myocardial infarction and antiarrhythmic drugs. They just used probability of death. They didn't need to convert to a different metric because every experiment they were aggregating used the same outcome measure. So that, I think, is the important theoretical question for us. And in the meantime, while we are figuring this out, I think we need to help people make better use of meta-analyses in real settings. And so I offer 4 questions that I hope might make consumers of educational research more critical consumers. So the first one is, does this solve a problem we have? This is the point about the bonus pay for teachers. Does this intervention solve a problem we have? How much improvement will we get? How much will it cost? And will it work here? Let me tell you about the last one. My current home state, Florida, has just written into the state constitution a maximum class size of 22. Not a law, it's now in the state constitution. And people are really pleased with this. For my county, a poor rural county, it has been a disaster. Because we now have to recruit people who, in my view, should not be teachers. So what's happened is the teaching quality in our county has plummeted because the creation of all these new jobs in affluent counties meant that all our good teachers went to work for Gainesville or for Jacksonville, leaving us bringing people in off the street without any qualifications at all. So in our county, our kids would be better off if we had classes of 40 with a few good teachers we've got left than in class sizes of 22, where they have 50% chance of actually being taught by somebody who doesn't know what they're talking about. So the important point, I think, is that there always has to be a local decision about whether this research is applicable here. Think about the ability grouping research. If we think that ability grouping is bad, but we systematically assign the best teachers to the lowest achieving groups, we might get a different result from what the published research says. So I think that last question is really important. It's not an automatic, mechanistic thing of just doing what you're told or what the RCTs tell you. I think teachers and educational leaders have to be critical consumers of educational research. And I hope that these 4 questions would actually be helpful in helping them engage with this process, while the rest of us are figuring out how to make meta-analyses and particularly effect sizes more meaningful. Thank you.